Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much, Kimberly. Appreciate your hosting duties, and thank you to everybody who has helped to organize the Open Education Conference this year. My name is James Glapper-Grossklag. I'm with College of the Canyons in Southern California, and I'm happy to welcome everybody to this session entitled Iterating Stewardship in Open Education. This is part of a project that our friends with the Community College Consortium for Open Educational Resources launched last year at the Open Education Conference in Phoenix the day before. A pretty large group, I think 60 or 70 folks, convened to discuss what we're seeing as emerging needs of the field as open education evolves from this sort of amorphous movement to a bit more of a professionalized field. And so conversations were had around the general topics that you see reflected on the left of the screen: sustainability, policy and strategy, stewardship, and professionalism. And the group we have here today is going to be sharing with you some thoughts about stewardship and what that means and what we've wrapped our minds around during the past year in talking through stewardship. And we want to first acknowledge the incredible work done by our colleagues Lisa Petrides, Doug Levin, and Edward Watson with publishing the CARE framework in 2018, which was launched at the Open Ed Conference in Niagara Falls. We are very respectfully using that as a jumping off point to pose questions about what stewardship might mean today for our field, as again, we continue to evolve from this loose movement to more of a professional field, whatever that might mean, however we might define that. But we think it's key that we have the definition in our hands and not in others' hands. I'm going to move on here. Let's see if I can move to the others next up. There we go. So over the past year, we have a lot of discussions around the topic of stewardship. You see the names of great folks here on the left-hand side of the screen. Those of us who have bolded names are with you today to share our thoughts around some key questions about stewardship. And oops, I'm having a little trouble moving things on here. Sorry about that. We are looking for your feedback throughout the session, and after the session, we will very sincerely and genuinely use your feedback to further evolve our thinking. The ultimate outcome of our thinking and our discussion will be another version of the CARE framework. We're in dialogue with Lisa, Doug, and Eddie. We are not 100% certain at this point whether we will collaborate on another version of the CARE framework or whether we will publish new versions that are in dialogue with one another. But our overall intention is to bring more contemporary, more current concerns into that framework. So we'll start though with a definition of stewardship, which is an ethic that embodies the responsible planning and management of resources, generally recognized as the acceptance or assignment of responsibility to shepherd and safeguard the valuables of others. So the sense of ethical responsibility. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues who will walk you through some of the key questions that we've formulated during the past year of discussing this. So we're going to turn it over to our friend Andy.
Hi, everybody. My name is Andy McKinney. I'm the OER coordinator at the Office of Library Services in the central office of the City University of New York. We, along with my colleague Ann Fidler, we sort of administer money that we get from the state and give it out to our campuses to work on OER projects. That'll be 24 campuses serving around 275,000 degree-seeking students. So this question about labor and where this is for stewardship is sort of near and dear to my heart, specifically when we're talking about contingent faculty and support staff, as my entire academic career has essentially been as contingent support staff and contingent faculty, whether that be part-time or in one-year contracts. So we want to ask the question for labor, recognizing that labor arrangements sometimes place an inequitable burden on contingent faculty and support staff. How do stewards support and seek appropriate compensation and recognition for creators and collaborators. So I think I want to just point out that I think there's really important work that the CARE framework does early on in sort of setting the scene for how OER stewardship requires what they call means and opportunities. However, my question would be, how much does what they would say, quote, the democratization of the production and refinement of instructional materials, how much can that happen without building that off the back of uncompensated and insecure labor? So we think that as the field grows and more actors enter the space, the labor that makes that growth possible needs to be foregrounded, right? We need to talk about this as labor. So we need to make sure that the activity of this community is understood in that framework and work that's deserving of both compensation and recognition, and not just a kind of voluntarism that can be exploited by any actor entering the field. So, my answer to this question is first, the labor of OER development and stewardship of the field deserves to be compensated and recognized. I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. Compensation is a difficult thing. At CUNY, we're in the lucky position to have state funding so we can fund faculty and staff members, right? So, but compensation is key, and especially that. So for contingent faculty, you'll engage a much larger population of your teaching faculty if you're offering contingent faculty a stipend, or you're bringing them into the fold in general. Depending on your institution, your contingent faculty are going to be teaching the lion's share of your courses. So it's important to include them if you want to steward OER into your campus at all. So I think this includes compensation for creation, revision, adoption. From a campus or assistant level perspective, this also includes something like a fellowship program or a stipend or incentives towards continued teaching practices, teaching contracts. I think this also goes for your adjunct librarians, right? For what we would call at CUNY a college assistant, people who are in support staff stuff. We're looking at instructional designers in that same way. So, from the sort of institutional level, whether that be campus or system level or even state level, I think these are the types of things you can do. But also, if you're a private company working with faculty creating new content that you're going to serve on your platform, that means paying faculty for creation, even if it's just for ancillaries like assessments. So, I think oftentimes, we hear from faculty and from others, what if we don't have the money, or, I'm already teaching so much. This extra $1,000 isn't really what I need. What I need is time. And so I think recognition for that time is also key for everyone. That's key to full-timers. I think there's a number of presentations, including one that I'm going to give 1 o'clock on Wednesday, about tenure and promotion, right? And how do we make sure that we recognize OER work as something that works towards tenure and promotion and isn't just sort of shuffled off to the side as service or just teaching, right? So, but that's just for full-timers. But for part-timers, we're also talking about reappointment letters. We're talking about awards. We're talking about including them in all sorts of things. And so I want to wrap myself up here very quickly, but I think a sideline of this to me is the inclusion of contingent faculty and staff, part-time ID folks or adjunct librarians in professional development activities, either compensated or paid for if it's external, right? So part of contingency is not being afforded the opportunities to grow at one's craft in the same way that full-time workers are. So giving contingent workers the opportunities to work on that craft says, A, we value your contributions, and B, we want you to remain a part of the community. So helping people and it also can help people get full-time work as they sort of build their portfolios, build their experience, including them in that professional development as a way to steward them and the movement itself towards something better. So with that, I'll let it go and pass it off to, I believe, Judith.
Thank you, Andy. I appreciate it. I'm Judith Sebesta. I serve as the Executive Director of the Digital Higher Education Consortium of Texas. And I think probably many of you here are aware that OER offer a variety of benefits for students, including things like always available for free or low cost for hard copies, easy to find and access even before class starts, perpetual access, and they can be customized and relevant. Studies show that 93% of students who use OER do as well or better than those using traditional materials, since they have easy access to the content starting day one of the course. That's really only one of the reasons. And I'm going to drop in the link to that source of that information here into the chat box for you. Just that comes from Spark. So at the same time, we've seen an increased student interest in OER. For example, things like the Open Textbook Alliance of the U.S. Student Public Interest Research Group, student interns at organizations like OpenStax, and marketing campaigns aimed at students like the very recent Free the Textbook campaign, which provides a toolkit for students to advocate for OER to their campus leaders. So to this end, we would like to see an increased emphasis on students within the OER space in the CARE framework. So the question that we're asking is, recognizing that OER is sometimes embedded in the power structures of those who have traditionally produced and distributed commercialized knowledge, how do stewards encourage contributions by and support for voices of learners who have not been included in commercialized knowledge? Next question.
All right, thank you, Judith. We're going to go on to Nathan.
Thank you, Judith. Thanks, Jane. I'm Nathan Smith. I'm a OER coordinator and a philosophy instructor at Houston Community College. And what I want to talk about is privacy. This is kind of an area where I think there's been a lot of discussion around the role of digital materials in education in a way that sort of expands on what the CARE framework had addressed. So this is kind of a new dimension that I think we really ought to think about as we're thinking about our stewardship practices around OER. So we want to say that recognizing that openly licensed materials may be reused in ways that can harm learners, how can stewards consider users' privacy and consider that data and surveillance practices of platforms that host OER? So I want to talk a little bit about what do we mean by this idea that openly licensed materials can be used in ways that may harm learners. That may sound a little odd to some folks, but what I think we're referring to here is a concept that I think is really well articulated by Shoshana Zuboff in her book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. The idea is that much of current technology, including educational technology, has built a capitalist framework that extracts value out of what she calls the behavioral surplus of our online actions. So when we're online, when we're clicking on links, when we're doing searches, when we're engaging with a textbook that may be embedded in a platform, all of our behaviors are being captured by systems. And all that captured behavior then allows companies to build products for predicting what people will do and then sell that off to others. Now, certainly there's a positive way that this might be used in education. So you might think that, for instance, data on student interaction with textbooks or OER or materials online could be used to improve student learning, to make the textbooks better. That is a positive way that material might be used. But essentially any other use, anything outside of improving student learning is exploitative of students. And we should be aware of the way that is possible. In particular, when we release materials through an open license, we lose control over those materials intentionally. And so what we see is that open educational resources may get used in platforms and in services that have a different set of values and different intentions than we may have imagined. So how do we respond to that, right? So this is the kind of familiar, we'll put this under the rubric of open wrapping, the idea that we take OER and build it into a software platform that then delivers that content to students with courseware, which is to say all of the bells and whistles that some instructors expect. Now, how can we combat that? Well, one way that we might think to combat it is to use more restrictive licensing. And I think this is a debate that we ought to have. We want to consider whether that restrictive licensing serves the purposes that we want, or whether it has other harms to the open process, the open education that we want to promote. Another way that I think we are trying to sort of serve with this by adding this dimension to the care framework is community awareness, educating folks about the ways that these that online educational technology can be used to exploit the data of students, or potentially to take what students are doing online and to use it for other purposes that may not serve the purposes of education. And then the final thought I'll just throw out there is like another way to think about this is, I think when we confront this dilemma with educational technology tools about, well, how am I going to teach, given that possibly these tools might use student data or use student information in ways that are harmful, something like a Turnitin or something, which actually takes work of students and uses it for the purpose of selling the platform, right? What am I going to do about that? And what I would just encourage people to do is just always to think a little bit more outside of that dichotomy, that sort of the confines that we get tracked into. See if we can reimagine pedagogy in a way that opens things up even more. So with that, I'll turn it over to James, who I think is going to be talking about closely related concept.
Yes, thank you, Nathan. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm going to talk about the idea of consent, and this is the fourth sort of bundle of concerns, or a bundle of questions that we've identified around stewardship. And as Nathan indicates, this is kind of the flip side of what Nathan was talking about with privacy. I'll read the question first and then talk our way through it briefly. Recognizing that learners are sometimes are not able to exercise agency with respect to their artifacts and data, how do stewards promote learners' rights to exercise informed consent around their artifacts and data? In other words, we know that within the academy, a power relationship exists, and students are not always able to opt in or opt out, even though institutions, commercial entities, individual faculty might say, sure, students have a choice. So how do good stewards respond to that and ensure that informed consent is part of our practice? And by consent, I certainly do mean informed consent, more than the terms and conditions we typically click off and sign off on without reading. How do we not only permit students to engage in informed consent, but promote awareness on the part of students about what they're consenting to and what they're participating in? And this happens at a couple of different levels. I think, first of all, it happens in a increasingly positive way through an increasing use of open pedagogy or open teaching practices. We want to co-create with our students. There's more and more conversation around that. We want to engage in project-based learning. We want students to help us revise a textbook, not just hand them a textbook. We want to co-create that knowledge. Terrific. If we do that, however, and let's say our institution or our funder automatically places a CC BY license on that content, and our students' work is part of that larger work that has a CC BY license, then downstream, as Nathan was talking about, what if the use of that work downstream subjects students to being part of the surveillance capitalism machine, and a student who has participated in co-creation becomes aware that their work is somehow being used to lure students into a network or a web that they don't want to be a part of. How do we let students know what's going to happen to their content? What's going to happen to the data that they contribute perhaps to a study? Do we teach licensing? Does teaching about licensing become part of our practice as stewards? Does creating multiple opt-ins and multiple opt-outs become part of what it means to be a good steward engaging with our students? Or does that overcomplicate things as an instructor or as an institution? Those are some of the questions that we're trying to wrap our heads around and that we'd really love to have your feedback on. With that, I'm going to go to the next slide and remind you that we genuinely want to receive your feedback on this form. The collective we in the stewardship group, we will continue to chew on these questions and integrate as much of your feedback as we can. And as I said at the outset, we're in dialogue with the authors of the original care framework, and our ideas will either infuse a care framework 2.0, or it will come up as a document that's in dialogue with the care framework. So we're still working out what that final product will look like. With that, I think we're going to turn it over to the audience for some Q&A. And I think that Q&A, we do that via the chat, I imagine. So we'll open that up to the chat. Let's see if we have anybody in the chat who's posing some questions for us. Thank you, Kathy. Likes the dialogue idea, dialogue with the original care framework. And Nathan is also putting the link to the feedback form in the chat multiple times. So thank you.
You're all also welcome to unmute yourselves and give your feedback or ask your questions with your own voice if you'd like.
Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you. Oh, and if someone could post a link to the original care framework. There we go. Thank you so much. So yeah, sorry, Joe. We are elaborating on or referencing the care framework without unpacking that for the audience. Sorry about the really the lack of ability to do that given the timing. That was a really powerful and thoughtful statement that came out in 2000. It was published in 2018 that essentially said, as open education grows, it's important that we, the collective we in the field, view ourselves as stewards of the commons, so to speak. And in order to be good stewards, we will try to engage in the following types of behavior and promote the following types of values. So very broadly. Great, thank you, Billy. Appreciate that. Any questions? Come on, unmute yourselves. Any contributions? Any questions? We're counting on a good discussion here.
Hi, my name is Amy Spies. I'm from the Illinois Board of Higher Education, and I really appreciate your presentation. I'm very interested in your ideas, your 4 categories of stewardship, and I'd love to see more about that. But it just seems like the idea of teaching the licensing is vital to students understanding what they're getting themselves into. But I just wonder how we do that from a practical standpoint. I formerly taught freshman composition. It seems like that might be a natural place for understanding the licensing, but not necessarily. So I just wonder if this were to become like a course of some kind, or maybe it becomes a general education requirement, where would you put it in the curriculum?
Great question, Amy. Very briefly, I'll share that I know a lot of librarians who engage in that kind of instruction in collaboration with their discipline colleagues. So at some institutions that are fortunate enough to have OER librarians, the OER librarians will go into a class and collaborate with the instructor and students before they engage in an open pedagogy project. They'll learn about the licensing.
We have reached the end of the session, so I am going to stop the recording right now. However, this room will be open for another 15 minutes for you to continue this excellent dialogue. Please don't let the fact that I'm stopping the recording stop you.
Thank you, Kimberly. So now the recording